Welcome to room 8, Miss Snyder's second grade classroom. And right now you are looking at my beautiful little second grade children who are always on their best behavior, or at least I wish they would be. And even though they are perfectly perfect in every way, I have found that there are some things in our classroom that needed a change. And so following this video, you will be able to see the way our classroom looked before the changes and after the changes, and you will also be hearing about the many different improvements that we have made in our classroom due to the changes that were made. One of the first problems I had to fix in my classroom was the physical arrangement of my student desks. In the beginning of the year, I chose to arrange my students in groups because I anticipated the fact that I would be using a lot of cooperative learning and I would be using a lot of partner work. I do teach second grade, and so my students are fairly young. They need to work with one another to build their social skills and to help each other learn and to figure out new strategies, especially when they're doing math. The problem that I'm having is that my students have now gotten to know each other very well, and I have little cliques of students who are best friends, and then I have students who have found that they really just don't get along very well. Well, my groups haven't changed much, and so students that are facing each other are either chatting constantly because they're best friends and they just can't stop talking to each other, especially when they're looking at each other. And at the same time, I have students that are sitting next to one another and they found that they really don't like each other, so they're annoying each other to the point where I have to stop my instruction and fix the behavior problem. A lot of times when I have to fix a behavior problem, that involves me actually removing a student from the group. And then, of course, everyone realizes that this has happened because I have one student desk by itself and the rest of my classroom is in groups. Now, this is definitely not fair to that child because anyone who comes in my classroom kind of looks at that desk and knows that that student has been the behavior problem. And it also prevents a problem for me because when I do group work, I have students already in groups, and then I have that student that's singled out, and I have to ask myself, well, do I put them back into the group, or do I make that student work by themselves because they can't seem to get along with each other, which definitely isn't fair, and it also isn't helping them learn. In order to change my classroom arrangement, I wanted to research and find something that would allow me to have my students still working together, but would give them a little more space and a little less temptation than sitting across from each other, because I know I personally, much older than them, if I was facing someone who was my very good friend, I would want to talk to them. And so I have found the horseshoe seating arrangement. As you can see, my horseshoe is not a standard physical classroom arrangement of a horseshoe. Technically, in a horseshoe, you're supposed to have two straight parallel lines, and then the back sort of forms a semicircle. But unfortunately, with my guided reading table and the bookshelves that line my classroom, I just didn't have enough space to create a true horseshoe. And also, I was trying to abide by the guidelines of my research that said students really need to have some space. And if I crammed them all together back there in the back of my classroom into sort of a semicircle, I was afraid that my students probably would still be talking as much as they had been in the group setting. I have to say that I really do enjoy this new classroom arrangement. One of the best things is that all of my students are now focusing their attention on me and the smartboard, which is what they should have been focusing on all the time. I actually am a little embarrassed that I have set students in the beginning of the year to be facing one side of the room or facing some of their classmates. Another thing that I really like is the fact that I can walk straight through the classroom at any given time and be at any of my students' desks within a moment's notice. This was actually very hard for me when my students were in groups because I would have to come through them and kind of stand behind them in order to figure out how they were working, and I would have to bend down beside them to see the kind of work they were doing or to give them help because they had tons of students around them. In this type of setting, I can walk right over to my student's desk, look at how they're working, help them if they need help, or even point out some mistakes that they're making while they're working, or even just tell them that they're doing a great job. I really have liked this setting, and I will say that it has cut down on the amount of socializing that my students do. When they came in the morning, they were completely shocked that I had changed their desks, and a lot of them were actually very happy about it. You will notice two desks inside of my horseshoe, and these are not behavior problems. These are just students who were grouped in the group setting before, but were around students who they weren't really bothered by. And these are students that do have extenuating circumstances and they do enjoy their personal space. And so for them, they preferred to be in the middle of what they called my square, of course, instead of a horseshoe. They preferred to be in the middle than actually a part of the group, which I wasn't bothered by either because I still have the ability to walk around their desks and to get to all of my other students, like I said, within a moment's notice. The next problem that I had to deal with were some obstructed views that I had created in my own classroom without even realizing it. When I establish my centers, I always try to really save space and keep them kind of spread out so that my students avoid talking with one another and they actually get time to really produce some independent work. As you'll see in the bookshelf at the top of the picture, I kind of created a little bit of a hiding spot for my students, if you'll say that, with the big bookshelf in the middle and then the two smaller bookshelves on either side. What I thought I was doing was saving space. I thought I would have my students on one side of the bookshelf in their browsing box center, and then on the other side of that big bookshelf is a pocket chart center, and I made sure I picked that big bookshelf because it was just big enough for the pocket chart. It was really easy, and I thought my students would be far enough away from each other on either sides of the bookshelf to keep the talking down. Problems started to occur, however, when if you look at the counter by the window, students who would go to games by the counter and students who were in pocket chart started to intermix. The problem is when I'm sitting at my guided reading table, I can't see over that big bookshelf. I don't know if students are working in pocket chart. I don't know if students are working in games. I really don't know who is over there unless I walk myself over and take a look. I actually found myself yelling across the room, embarrassingly enough, a few times, "Whoever's over there, you need to keep the talking down," which sounds completely unprofessional, the fact that I don't even know which children of mine are where and who's making the sounds. So I decided to make some changes. It's not a really big change to make, but it did change up the centers in my classroom. I moved the large bookshelf out, as you'll notice in the bottom of the picture, and combined the two smaller bookshelves, and that became my plain old browsing box center. I actually took pocket chart down and kind of intermixed it and put it together with my word work center so students could actually work with their alphabets and their words and their vocabulary and take that and form sentences, which is what they were doing in pocket chart anyway. There were really no problems with it, and I actually love the fact that now at my guided reading table I can look over the bookshelf and make sure that I have one student in games and I have all students in browsing box who are supposed to be there. Then the students who are in pocket chart are now in word work, and they're actually using the skills with their vocabulary to form sentences and produce writing pieces. So all in all, it was a really, really good classroom decision. I actually used our class text to find the research to support the move and the change that I made in my classroom. I thought it was pretty embarrassing that the actual text says that I should be conscious of the placement of bookcases, file cabinets, and other pieces of furniture and equipment that can block your line of vision. So pretty much if I would have had this book at the beginning of the year, I might have saved myself a few behavior issues and a few interruptions from my guided reading groups. One of the other things that I did want to say is that this chapter of the book also recommends to keep high traffic areas free of congestion, and I think one of the things I also saved in the way of moving that large bookshelf was the fact that I have my baskets where students turn in their work on that counter where the game center is, and a lot of times students were having to walk completely around this large bookshelf to go and put their paper in, and then they would have to walk the whole way back again, which doesn't seem like really a large problem, but when you're talking about 23 students all going to the same basket around the same bookshelf, the problem does become large if students are going one way and then they're trying to get back to their seats, and before I know it, I have a large traffic jam. In just moving that one large bookshelf and moving the browsing box center down a little bit, students could just get out of their seats, walk to the right, put the paper in the basket, and come right back. There was no more loop-de-loo around the bookshelf or push each other quickly behind the big bookshelf where Miss Snyder can't see. It was a very, very quick and easy change. The third problem or change I had to make to my classroom involved organizing classroom supplies. This was not an original problem that I had, but it was a problem that I encountered when I actually started to do my classroom makeover. In the beginning of the year, I had my students arranged in groups or tables, and so I created caddies with table numbers on them that held all supplies that my students might need or would even think about needing when we did crafts or projects or even just pencils throughout the day. It was an amazing idea. It cut down a lot of the walking around that my students do. I have less students going to the pencil sharpener. Really, it saved a lot of time, and I really liked them having that because then not everybody had to get up and go find a green crayon or go find scissors. Everything was right there when they needed it. problem started to occur for me when I actually made my first classroom change, and I changed my classroom from the table setting to the modified horseshoe. As you can see in the picture at the bottom, the table caddies were still being used, but they were spread out all around the room, and so not all students could get in that caddy and get what they needed right at that moment for the project. I had some students saying, well, now caddy 2 is in front of me and I'm supposed to use caddy 1. Do I use caddy 2? And other students are yelling from down the row, pass the caddy, I need scissors, or there's not enough scissors in here all of a sudden. It was really a large headache that I tried to find a way. I had to figure out a way where all of my students could still be using supplies without having to go to a central location, pick them up, and walk back to their seats, and I could still keep the classroom arrangement that was really, really helping my classroom. I decided to create something personal for each of my students where they could keep their things, and as a second grade teacher, some of my students like to bring in pencil boxes, but I really try to keep those out of my room. I know that they fall out of desks and then they're spilt everywhere, and students like to play with them when they're in their desks. A lot of my students in the past have kept them on top of their desks so they can open and close them and make noise and play with them, so I really try to stray away from the whole pencil box idea. I went to the dollar store and a few other places searching for something that my students could use, and I actually found these decorative takeout boxes. Typically, I wouldn't choose a takeout box as they're usually made from cardboard, and I know that they wouldn't hold the weight that school supplies carry with them. These, however, were made of hard plastic, and the handle was actually metal, so I thought that they would be pretty durable depending on what I was putting in them, which I knew was just some minor school supplies. I actually took them and I put the students' names on them, and then I put the things from the caddy in there that I thought they would need, and when I gave them to the students, I allowed them to put whatever they needed inside the caddy, and luckily for me, they actually held up. The takeout containers actually ended up working like a charm, and then the problem that I saw was, well, what am I going to do with them? Should I put them in one spot in the room and then everyone can get up and grab their container and go back to their seats? And then I thought about that, and that's exactly what I wanted to avoid. I didn't want to put the glue in one place in the classroom and have the scissors at another, because that takes at least 5-6 minutes for everyone to get up and go get their materials. So I'm absolutely obsessed with command hooks. Almost everything in my classroom is hung on a command hook, or at least with the sticky backing behind it, and they never fall off. I don't know what they're made of, but they're truly, truly magical tools. And so I thought, why not put a command hook in the front of my students' desks underneath the brown part, and then hang their takeout container, their little fun box, right on there. This way, the box is not next to them, they can't put their hands in it, and when they do go in their container to get something, I can see them. So if I announce that there's going to be a project, the way my classroom is now set up with this modified horseshoe, I see all of my students standing out of their desk and reaching over to grab their tools. This is also helpful to me because I can make sure that no one's playing in their toolbox, and I can make sure that nobody else is playing with anyone's tool container. They all have their names on them and they're in front of their desk. Something that's also easier for me is at the end of the day, when it's time to sharpen pencils, I can just walk around my horseshoe, grab all the pencils out of the containers, take them to the pencil sharpener, sharpen them, and then drop them back into their containers. I've tried the buckets by the pencil sharpener before, and almost 98% of the time, I will have a full bucket of sharpened pencils that has been picked up by my students, and no one ever drops the unsharpened pencils back in the container. So I end up wasting pencils and bending down in desks and searching for them and trying to figure out where all of my pencils have gone. This way I can manage my tools, and they're visually appealing to me at all times. Plus, my students were absolutely in love with their little polka dot containers, and they have their names on them, and it's also a fun kind of weird shape. It was something that they weren't used to. It wasn't just a piece of plastic or a basket. They were just completely stunned at the fact that they each had one. I'm not going to lie, it did take a little bit of time because I cut all the tops of the containers off, and I did put their names on them just in case any would fall off the command hook. I didn't want there to be an argument over whose container was on the floor. They had their name on it, so I would know exactly whose it was, but I think in time it was worth it. It saves us time getting up and going to get supplies. They no longer have to search for the caddy or pass this or pass that. They have everything they need, and it's not distracting to them, and it's actually easier for me to maintain the supplies and make sure that everyone has what they need. Sometimes I've actually gone in them
after school just to see, now that it's the end of the year, does everyone have a bottle of glue? We're doing a project tomorrow. I don't want to run into a situation where I have 5 and 6 students getting up and looking for a bottle of glue. So sometimes I'll just walk around and make sure that everybody has and is prepared for the activities for the following day. In doing research about this topic, I actually again used our text, and they said that keeping materials accessible minimizes time spent getting ready and cleaning up. I would absolutely agree with this. My students reach into their little boxes, pull out what they need, use it, and when it's cleanup time, they can pretty much just scoop it all up and put it back in the container. Of course, I have some students who have nice organized containers, and then other ones who kind of just throw everything in there and it looks like a big bucket full of fun. Organized classroom materials prevent disruptions within the classroom flow. This is very true as well. Like I said, I can continue my lesson and keep teaching, and they're getting their materials and everything is just running smoothly. And I do also agree with the fact that unorganized classroom materials are hard to manage, and they do force a teacher to use instructional time searching for materials. Last week when I had those caddies, I had students crying and complaining that they didn't have scissors, and so I actually had to stop teaching and walk around the room and find them a pair of scissors. In this situation, I don't. I've already made sure that everybody has the appropriate materials in their bucket and that they're ready to learn and do their activity. Well, that's the end of my classroom makeover. I really have enjoyed the different changes that I've made to my classroom, even though it was kind of at the end of the year this year. However, in doing the changes, I now know at least 3 things that I plan on doing at the start of the year next year, and things that are going to make my classroom move more smoothly and hopefully prevent any kind of behavior problems that I might encounter.